Here's critically acclaimed Bible scholar Erik getting upset at a pastor on TikTok.
Christians, stop claiming that you can prove the resurrection.
You know what? I'm going to say that I can prove the resurrection even harder now.
The resurrection is the most important event in the Christian story. The Apostle Paul goes as far as to say if the resurrection isn't true, then Christianity is in vain.
Come on now, preacher.
And yet, the resurrection has no historical proof.
No.
Yeah, they had us the first half, I'm not gonna lie.
We have some testimonies of early Christians written down in the New Testament, but beyond their testimonies, there is no archaeological, historical, or scientific evidence that the resurrection actually happened.
Yeah, that's not how history works. If we limited ourselves to what we can know about history from science and archaeology, we might as well shut down almost all of our history departments. The fact is, we know a lot about history that comes from testimony.
He goes on to give an example in support of this claim and then defends the testimony that we have in the Gospels. Now, in general, I agree that testimony is useful for doing history, even if harder data is more preferable when evaluating what happened in the past. But how does this really help his point? The question at issue isn't whether there is some evidence for Christianity, or even, as he wants to argue, enough to warrant belief. No. The question is, can we prove the resurrection happened with the data we have? Based on how Brandon and basically everyone else uses that word in everyday parlance, the answer is no. And having evidence for something a proof does not make.
People will say, prove it to me. Where's your proof?
Imagine that you have a court scene and the expert witness steps forward, the forensic scientist or the detective, to put forward, to present the murder weapon as a piece of evidence. And on the handle of the murder weapon are the fingerprints of the accused. Now, does that prove that the defendant is guilty? Well, no. I mean, you could think of some other potential explanations of how the fingerprints came to be there.
Y'all need to get on the same page.
You know what? I'm going to say that I can prove the resurrection even harder now.
I'm not going to parse every point of disagreement between them, but Brandon's concern seems to be that if apologists oversell the evidence for Christianity, it's going to backfire. Which is 100% correct. This is a point I've been making for years. But if apologists want to keep saying things like,
you know what? I'm going to say that I can prove the resurrection even harder now.
Then I guess they're free to dig their own graves. Instead of saying stupid things like that, what Erik should have done to defend his position was concede the general point, but argue that Robertson's solution just falls to the other extreme. He could argue something like, we may not be able to prove that the resurrection happened, but we have very good reasons to believe that it did, and then proceed to defend his position by appealing to very conservative approaches towards biblical scholarship, most notably championed by a biologist, a philosopher, and his wife with an English Lit degree. Now, before McGroupies watching this have an aneurysm, I'm actually reading Lydia McGrew's newest book, and so are a few others. Expect a book review of sorts coming up at some point in the future. But the gist of how to push back against how Erik and others defend the Gospels is to 1. Go with them into the weeds of gospel reliability and argue that their arguments fail, or 2. Call the utility of the entire project into question. The reasoning behind 2 is this. Even if we grant that some Gospels can be classified as eyewitness testimony, and others as being based on eyewitness testimony, still written decades after the fact, mind you, it doesn't help their case for the resurrection as much as they seem to think. Why? Because if the world seems regular to you, then miraculous testimony of a religious nature by itself should not be enough to overturn that unified experience. And even if I'm wrong about that, and there were a situation where it should, what we find in the Gospels ain't it, Chief? But let me put a pin in that and address a common accusation aimed at this style of reasoning. Erik Wielenberg explains, quote, perhaps it will be objected that unless I can provide a sufficiently specific alternative explanation, it is irrational for me to reject the Christian explanation. But the principle underlying this objection, that a given explanation can be rejected rationally only if there is a sufficiently specific alternative explanation available, is false. The style of inference known as the inference to the best explanation would be labeled more accurately the inference to the best and sufficiently good explanation. Some explanations are so bad that they can and should be rejected even if no detailed alternative explanation is available. And one way in which an explanation can be bad is by being extremely improbable. Reflection on some cases will reveal that this is so. Tabloid magazines are filled with accounts of incredible events. For a while, reported sightings of Elvis Presley abounded. Must we examine all the available evidence for such events and develop detailed alternative explanations before it is rational for us to reject the claim that the incredible event in question actually took place? Of course not. We do not need to interview the witnesses, inspect the physical evidence, and devise alternative scenarios to reject rationally the notion that Elvis really was spotted recently at a blackjack table in Las Vegas. End quote. Non-Christians do not have to come up with an elaborate explanation that accounts for every apologetic detail in order to reject the resurrection in good faith. If someone asks,
what actually happened if Jesus didn't rise from the dead then?
There's nothing wrong with saying, I'm not exactly sure, but there are plenty of sufficiently good explanations that are better than yours. Many Christians are comfortable with this kind of reasoning in any other circumstance, but can't seem to let go of their double standard for Jesus. Anyway, what's my defense of the claim that miraculous testimony of a religious nature by itself shouldn't overturn our experience? Tap this video next to me to find out.